Chapter 10. The Devils and the Idols. But someone will say, if the gods are thus real powers and centers of vitality in the human body and in humanity at large, what about the devils? What are they? The reply, of course, is they are the same. The devils are very real powers and centers of human energy and vitality. But yet there is a difference, and the difference may perhaps be broadly defined thus: that the gods are powers making for life and harmony, and the devils are powers making for discord and death. There are centers in the human body and mind which make for corruption. We know that. There are centers of disease in the body, alien growths which consume and waste its substance. Centers of disease in the mind, alien and consuming passions, ungoverned greeds and desires, hatreds, vanities. There are such things as lust without love, desire of food and drink without reverence for health, love of power without pity, love of gain without charity. Each one sees that here are centers of activity in the human being which in the long run must lead to corruption and disintegration. There are similar centers in society at large, and the life of the race. If the higher centers and those which lead to beneficial and harmonious and permanent activities are the foci where the gods dwell, then these others are the seats of what we call diabolic and demonic agencies. The personification, the glamour, the domination of the latter are as easy to explain as of the former. Take any one of the instances above, say the love of power. Far back in the history of the race did the domination of one individual by another, little known among the animals, begin. How many thousands and thousands of times to the ancestors of each of us has the face of some petty tyrant made itself hateful? How deeply have his cruelties, his meannesses, seared the memory of his features in the heart of his victim? How intensely may this long line of memories have come down surrounded by a glamour of fear and hatred? How easy to see that a certain similarity of features and expression in this long line may have given rise to the joint picture of a diabolic figure delighting in cruelty and tyranny, a veritable Satan, composite indeed of race memories, yet lurking terrible in the subconsciousness of every child, and even of the adult man or woman. Or, to take another example, how many thousands of times to our feminine ancestors may the features of lust without love have made themselves fearful and terrible? And how easily out of the combined memory of these may the likeness arise of a devil of lust and sensuality, haunting certain centers of imagination and association in the brain, and so on. But there is another side, too, to the question. Not only do we all bear in our heredity the remembrance of countless tyranny suffered, and the vague image of a devil corresponding whom we hate, but we also and similarly bear the remembrance of tyranny inflicted on others, and the pleasure accompanying, from immemorial time, such exercise of power. Over and over again the lower human and animal nature within our countless ancestors has rejoiced in its sense of power accompanying some cruel and tyrannous action, till at last such actions have been invested with a sort of glamour, and the temptation to tyrannize, actually to inflict pain, may come down to us with an attraction otherwise hard to explain. Or change the wording of the above, and for tyranny read selfishness, greed, lust, and so forth, and we see that the argument is the same. The greed that we hate in others with a composite hatred has a fatal and complex hold on ourselves, and the devil figure, whom at one moment we detest, at another moment exercises over us a strange and lurid fascination, pushing us on to the very deeds we abhor. The strange psychology of passion is difficult to understand in any other way. The inordinate enchantment which surrounds the pleasures of the senses, so disproportionate to the actual enjoyment experienced, the mania to which it may rise, of drink or greed, or whatever it may be. The sense so frequent of a diabolic power impelling one, the abhorrence, even while they are being perpetrated, of the actions which we call our own. All this seems only explicable by the fact that we bear in our bodies the experience and memory of countless beings, who, having witnessed or embodied the same action from opposite sides, transmit to us on one side an intense and reduplicated magnetism in its favor, and on the other side a multiplied hatred of it, and from both sides the sense of a sinister agency at work within. The strife between human beings in the past and arising out of the life of the senses is reenacted in miniature and in memory within our own breasts. There the reconciliation waits to be worked out and the strange justice of nature to be fulfilled. But it is obvious that where such conditions exist and the sense of diabolic is present, we are dealing with centers which contain the elements of strife and disintegration within ourselves, and which are therefore leading towards corruption, insanity, and death. But it will be asked, if the devils represent centers of corruption, how can they be related or assimilated to the gods, who are the expression and embodiment of great formative ideas? The answer is, simply enough, because the devils also represent formative ideas, but ideas of a lower grade, which necessarily in time have to be superseded. These particular centers of activity, in fact, in the human race and human body, have not always been centers of corruption or degeneration, quite the reverse, though there are various ways in which they may have become so. Originally perfect, natural, and healthy, like all the animal instincts say, and therefore carrying the sense of pleasure and goodness with them, yet any one of them may in course of time become disproportionately developed, and lapse into conflict, therefore, with the rest of the nature. Or it may, as it grows, develop seeds of strife within itself. Or, as humanity grows and changes and adjusts itself round other centers, the center in question may have to be readjusted or broken up. In any of these cases, the sense of evil will be developed in connection with it, and the continuance of the center in its particular course will involve the threat of corruption and death to the race or the individual. Thus the agencies or personalities which are associated with these centers take on a maleficent aspect. They may not have worn this always, they may have been angels and gods, and the power and fascination that they exercise is mainly due to the long far back and beneficent root activity of the ideas which they represent in the human race. But now they are become falling angels, dethroned gods, Lucifers with a lurid light upon them, and the pleasures and activities associated with them have become delusive pleasures, insane and fruitless activities, stricken and made barren by the pain and suffering of others who are involved. They stand for motives which are being ejected from the bosom of humanity. To this class belong a vast number of material and animal pleasures and satisfactions. What joy remains in the mere acquisition or spending of wealth, when the inevitable suffering of those from whom it is wrung begins to be realized? Or what an ambition or domination or selfish gratification, when the others who represent the reverse of the shield are considered and cared for? Not that the ideas of wealth or praise or power or passion may not in essence be perfectly good and useful, but the special forms which they have hitherto worn have proved unworthy, and are being superseded or modified. The root ideas are changing their aspect. It is needless to recall in detail the fact that the gods of one age or race become the devils of another. It falls naturally into place here. With Christianity, as we have seen, the human mind grouped itself round other centers of interest and activity than in the old paganism. A tremendous revolution, in fact, in humanity was taking place, and the physiological equipoise was tending towards a denial of the more animal and natural centers in favor of the more spiritual and ascetic. The pagan centers of life became decadent. The pagan gods were changed into devils. Apollo became Apollyon. Aphrodite, or Venus, the stately goddess of love, queen of the world and rewarder of heroes and warriors, became a mere demon and enchantress. And Pan, that wonderful impersonation of animal nature, wore his horns and goat's hooves now in the character of Satan. But similar revolutions had taken place before, and as the gods of Christianity were now driving out the gods of Olympus, so had these in their time driven out Kronos and Rhea and their crew, and these again had disenthroned the primitive deities Uranus and Gaia, strange far-back records of the growing life of the races within whose bosoms those gods dwelt. The hatred felt by one race for the gods of another and neighboring race is a thing of the same kind. It is almost a physiological hatred, and it indicates the great constitutional gulfs and differences of habit and life which separate the races. Baal and Ashtoreth were very respectable deities among the Phoenicians, and no doubt were at one period the emblems and expressions of their best life. But for the Israelites they were simply devils. I am not sure that the saints of the Catholic Church are not by some nonconformist sects looked at in the same light, and it is obvious that the great divisions of Europe into Catholic and Protestant and Greek Church is not so much a matter of intellectual rightness or wrongness of view, as of a difference of instinctive heredity and a distinction of race feeling between Latin and Teuton and Slav. From the same point of view, the way in which the race gods figure in all race conflicts, and the immense importance ascribed to them and their prevailment over the enemy, is a matter very easily intelligible. But to return to our devils, as I have said, the devils are gods which have gone astray, powers or forms which, once helpful and constructive in the human organism, have now become maleficent and destructive. Perhaps in the most primitive races it is not always easy to distinguish gods from devils. The instinct of self-preservation, for instance, is one of the earliest and most powerful instincts in animal and human life. It is largely represented in the lowest savages by fear. Fear rules in this center of self-preservation. Everything that can possibly harm the man is dreaded and avoided. Mental ingenuity is taxed to discover what may be possibly harmful. Fear is thus good, and a necessary condition of animal life and primitive human preservation, but it is also bad and destructive, and the more advanced the creature becomes, the more so. For as soon as the human brain becomes sufficiently developed to become capable of consciously entertaining within itself the images of fear, or the images of harmful and horrible things, it is already harming and injuring itself. Fear has already become destructive within it. The images of fearful things within the brain are already beginning the work of destruction, which the real things in the outer world are accused of. Thus fear is one of the most primitive, powerful, and widespread of the emotions. For a long time it rules in the center of animal and human life, and it has a beneficent as well as a maleficent aspect. From all this it can be easily understood how prolific a source it has been of deities, good and bad, and how among primitive races certain images invested with an age-long glamour of ancestral terror became transformed at last into veritable gods or devils. It does not matter whether they are wooden idols of a certain form and feature, or whether they are snakes' skins, or leopards' claws, or whether they are images of lions or crocodiles, or whether they are real lions or crocodiles, or whether they are black stones or hideous personifications of the powers of the air with 100 eyes and 100 arms. It does not matter whether it is the most innocent and harmless object, or the most really dangerous, as long as it is thought terrible, as long as the transformation of the race memory invests it. It is sufficient to remember the fowls, when the sweep's brush leaps out of the chimney top, when the cat flies up in the air, or even when the harmless solitary rook wings across the sky. Dame Partlet does not stop to scrutinize the object in the dry light of her own reason, but in the glamour of her race memory instantly sees the hawk devil impending overhead and flies for her life. Even among ourselves, civilized though we be, why do certain faces, certain expressions, certain grimaces, especially in childhood, and even if only portrayed on paper, afflict with such a painful and unreasoning sense of horror? Why is the dark so much more alarming to children, not to mention adults, than circumstances seem to justify? Why does such a simple thing as having someone walk continuously behind one in the street cause fidgets and creeps intolerable? Except that these things wake memories in us, memories innumerable of being pursued by man or animal, memories of time when the dark was full of danger, far more than now, and so forth. Lafcadio Hearn, indeed, in his Exotics and Retrospectives, suggests that the common nightmare in which one seems to lie powerless in the grasp of some terrible creature, of uncertain outline, arises in this kind of way. How often, he asks, going back through one's countless primitive human and animal ancestry, has it not really happened that a forefather or foremother has so lain, and been overpowered by the foe? And this terrible moment and others in like succession, burning themselves in the brain and transmitted to descendants, have fused into the awful imagery of the dream, in which the very confusedness of the obsessing figure is suggestive of its multiplex origin. Thus fear in the human race has been the source of countless deities, idols, fetishes, which have been invested in their various degrees with supernatural awe, or fascinating dread, or the most unreasoning terror, and which in proportion as fear itself, with the growth of humanity, has tended to be cast out, have tended also to lapse into devils, charms, and playthings, and to lose their ancient authority, while again in the form of awe, and especially associated with the marvelous and impressive moments and aspects of the planets and heavenly bodies, the same feeling has been the origin and inspiration of many of the grander and more enduring gods. But fear, of course, is by no means the only primitive emotion which has cast its glamour over objects and built up deities. Sex, hunger, the mother instinct, and many other passions have thus projected themselves. The pagan gods of the senses and passions, the fact that these deities were honored as gods and not feared as devils, shows that these instincts were on the whole healthy and in place. In fact, one sees with the passions generally that they are healthy as long as in place, and that their unhealthiness and devilry comes in when they usurp power and cease to be properly subordinate. With the incoming of Christianity, as I have already said, many of these deities became distinctly devils, partly perhaps because the passions corresponding were losing their natural place and balance at that time, and partly because by the strong Christian reaction towards asceticism, a kind of artificial overturn was being given to human nature. One feels that as long as Aphrodite occupied an honored and gracious position in the Greek Olympus, the passion which she represented must have been mainly honorable and gracious among those who worshipped her. When she fell, it became possible for the monkish writers to regard women as the incarnation of all filth and wickedness. No goddess of love exists in modern times, alas. For indeed love seems to have fled from public life into the utmost privacy and concealment, leaving only prostitution and the divorce court as its visible reminder in the world. The distinction between gods, devils, idols, fetishes, magical forms, etc., seems to be only one of degree. They are all cases in which an image, by virtue of association or memory, excites in the mind of the individual beholder a state of consciousness belonging to another order than that of his ordinary life. And it is this extended consciousness which fills him with amazement and impresses him so profoundly. Fetish worship is common enough, not only among savage peoples, but among modern nations. One of the most striking instances is that of a child with its doll. Think of the passionate love and admiration, the veritable ecstasy, which the little girl feels at the sight of its frizz-haired, blue-eyed babe. The latter's waxen nose has long ago been melted away by the fire, and the sawdust has run out of its legs. But that makes no difference. It is still the doll. The child knows perfectly well that the thing is not a baby, and has no sense or feeling, but it makes no difference, any more than it makes a difference to the fowls that they know quite well my cap is not an eagle. It is still the doll, the symbol, the hieroglyph, which wakes in the mind the immense ancestral emotion of countless mother love and passion, flowing down like a stream into its young life, and filling it with amazement. A great deal of ignorant contempt has been showered upon the worship of idols, but this is because the civilized man does not for a moment see or imagine what the idol means to the savage, any more than as a rule he understands what the doll means to his own little daughter. The savage knows as well as the civilized child, if either of them go so far as to analyze their consciousness, that the object of his devotion is a mere stock or stone. Yet what is that to him? To him the real and important fact is that this painted monster, this effigy, which for 100 generations has played its part in the history of his ancestors, overwhelms him with emotion, with wonder and fear, the rude smitings of conscience, and compels him to bow to a life, a presence which he cannot fathom. Or, to take an instance which appeals to the civilized man, consider for a moment the inordinate magic of gold. For a vast period, gold has been the symbol of power and well-being, and an object of pursuit. The inherited emotion of all those generations is in each of us, and flows swiftly, almost whether we will or no, towards the symbol when it appears. This little old woman, half-starved and in clothes rusty green and ragged with wear, walks the streets of London with her thousands in the bank, and her beady eyes glittering as she fingers the coins in her purse, is only an extreme case. There is something pathetic surely about her figure, for all these privations she suffers, and these sacrifices that she makes, are not really for the little gold pieces. They are only because the gold pieces waken her such wonderful memories, and the dim consciousness of the great life behind her, filling her with a strange joy she cannot explain. This indeed is her religion. Or the fetishes of royalty and titles. How explain the glamour which is upon these things, and the anxiety of American pork dealers to take part in them? A glamour which persists even when reason exposes the very prosaic and commonplace characters of those concerned, unless here again a transcendent sentiment is involved, and an instinct built up and confirmed during thousands of years. A curious case of fetish and magic is that of the spells and incantations. A spell is a spell. That is, it is the use of a form of spoken or written words. Today, the use of words has for the most part become commonplace, but there has been a time far back in history when to convey meanings in this way was little short of miraculous. Especially has this been true of the written word. There existed a few years ago, and probably yet exist, tribes in Central and South Africa to whom a piece of written paper, a letter in fact, was taboo. They would not touch it or come near it, for the fear and awe the mystery of writing inspired. In all early peoples writing is confined to the few, and to the many, for generation after generation, it is surrounded with such an atmosphere of wonder that at last it comes to partake of the supernatural. The Bibles and other writings of such peoples largely owe their sacredness to this fact, often more to this than to the value of the matter which they contain. And more than this, it is probable that the actual forms of words used in such writings, in Bibles, poems, prayers, recitations, incantations, used over and over again for scores of generations, come at last to carry with them a volume of race memory and race consciousness, so great as to give them a quite different value and force from ordinary language. How much of the magic which surrounds certain collocations of words in poetry is due to this fact, that they recall threads of ancient experience woven, as it were, in our very blood? As to spells and incantations, is it not really possible that certain forms of words, which have been used for immemorial time, have the power of waking in us forms of the race consciousness, with which they have been associated, and so under their influence, Satan or other powers of light and darkness may indeed appear? The same sort of thing is true of the magic of numbers. If written words excited wonder among the uninitiated, much more would numbers and their properties and signification. After a time they became positively sacred, and even today for many people, theosophists and others, a 3, a 4, or a 5, or a 7 bear some kind of religious glamour about them, and mystic meanings ineffable. The same, too, of simple geometrical figures, squares, and pentagons and hexagons, and it is not difficult to understand how these and the numbers entered into and became part of charms and incantations. My object throughout is to make it clear that all these things, these deities, devils, and fetishes, and the excitement produced by what appear commonplace and unimportant symbols, indicate real stirrings within us of another order of life and consciousness than that which with we are usually concerned, and that it is this fact which gives the symbols or images their value and potency. What further meanings this stirring of another order of consciousness within us may have, and how it relates to our individual lives and personalities, we may consider later on. Here it is sufficient to note that it seems to be the explanation of a vast number of phenomena that otherwise are obscure. Everywhere this glamour is to be found. How easy to see or feel, as suggested in an earlier chapter, when we look, for instance, at the young moon in the evening sky, in itself, of course, an impressive spectacle, that it is not merely our individual eyes that are following that luminous crescent over the mountains, but that within us millions of eyes are gazing, with a thrill of multitudinous emotion far beyond the experience of one twilight scene, or one life. How easy to see that the scepter or rod which the king bears in his hand, or whip on the Egyptian monuments, carries a glamour of awe with it, because the actual rod in times past descended on the backs of our successive ancestors, and left an accumulated impression there, still vibrating in heredity. The various animals, which naturally played so important a part in the life of the early races, and entered so deeply into their consciousness, became invested with a corresponding glamour, and there is hardly a creature, bird or fish or bull, or cat or beaver or kangaroo, which by some race, Egyptian or African or Australian or American Indian, has not been made fetishistic, totemistic, or divine. The same of many trees and plants. As to parts of the body, it seems natural enough that the phallus and the yoni, in almost every race of the world, have been treated as objects of worship and emblems of devilry or divinity. For these symbols appeal to every human being, and for good or bad, the accumulated ancestral magic surrounding them must be enormously powerful. But even other parts of the body partake of the same enchantment, and it is well known that the mistress's eyebrow, or the hair, or the hand, or even some article of clothing, have in cases a kind of supernatural attraction, which we may fairly ascribe to a more specialized subconscious association of the same character. A curious instance of the rousing of the communal or race consciousness is given by the word testes, which signifies both a witness and a testicle, the double signification being illustrated by the fact that among many peoples the taking of an oath is confirmed by the placing of the hand on the part indicated. More than any other fact, this helps us to understand the sacredness of sex in some early times, and how the sense of the communal life and divinity in connection with sex was so strong that an oath taken thus was as good as taken in the presence of the god.